Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on the recently published anthology, Imprisoned Souls, Poems of Uyghur Prisoners in China. This is a profoundly important collection featuring the works of 25 poets who are either detained or imprisoned. And our source material really details the fraught process of compiling these poems and illuminates the intense motivations of everyone who brought this work to the world.
It really is. It's more than just a book. It's a monument built from necessity. And I think examining that necessity reveals a fundamental tension in how we should interpret its lasting purpose.
That tension is exactly what drives our central debate today. Does the primary significance of this anthology lie in its immediate and frankly urgent function as a tool for international human rights activism, demanding justice and freedom for these detained poets? Or is its most enduring value found in its successful role as cultural preservation and literary rescue? I'll be arguing that, given the current crisis, the book's paramount importance must be as a necessary, urgent activist intervention.
And while I understand the gravity of that urgency and I agree intervention is critical, I believe that the book's true lasting contribution transcends any short-term policy demands. For me, its foundational strength is its successful act of cultural retrieval, rescue, and preservation. It's about ensuring the survival of the Uyghur spirit and language against, a state-sponsored campaign of aggressive erasure. The preservation is the long-term act of defiance.
Well, my central argument really rests on the immediate ethical imperative here. This book is fundamentally an act of bearing witness, an urgent intervention driven by the atrocities the poets are facing. The editor, Aziz Izakun, he didn't start this project for literary posterity. He was compelled by the overwhelming weight of persecution, the, quote, mass detention, arrest, and disappearance of Uyghur poets. That pressed upon him. And this urgency created a deep and varying need to bring their poetic voices to the wider world. The entire genesis of the anthology frames this as a plea for immediate action.
I see the emotional and ethical impetus, of course, but the urgency he felt was a response to the state's violence against the culture. So while the action he seeks is political, sure, the book's enduring strength is found in the content it preserves, which is, I think, inherently resistant to that violence. The poetry itself is the enduring artifact of resistance, not just the packaging designed to spur human rights action.
But that packaging is essential if we want justice. The book serves as a direct, undeniable call for justice and freedom, underpinned by the editor's firm belief that, quote, justice will shine for the Uyghurs. It insists that these poets must be freed from suffering in Chinese prisons simply for expressing themselves. The purpose is not merely academic, it is deeply political. As one speaker at the launch emphasized, this is, quote, not just poetry. It's about human rights as well. The entire apparatus of publication is aimed at challenging a persecution that has managed to go largely, unchallenged internationally.
I acknowledge the necessity for that political visibility. It's absolutely crucial to the prisoners' welfare. But that's a temporal measure. It's the fight for their immediate freedom. The enduring value of the book, however, I think is defined by its success in safeguarding the cultural and intellectual life that the regime sought to eliminate. When we read this, we're meant to focus on the resilience, the humanity, and the art of the poets themselves, not just view it as a political indictment. I don't accept the idea that this is merely a political pamphlet, even if it has political consequences.
It's a document of persecution that uses art as its language.
It is, but let's examine that language. Scholars noted that the collection is largely defined by expressions of love, of sorrow, nostalgia for homeland, tradition. It was explicitly noted that this is not a collection of seditious or overtly oppositional material. The poetry uses classic literary forms, drawing on symbols of nature, traditional Persian poetic structures. It showcases profound cultural depth, not revolutionary extremism. And by foregrounding this artistic and deeply human content, the book achieves a profound act of retrieval that defies the state narrative more effectively than simple political declarations.
But the act of collecting the poems, the logistics of that retrieval, was undertaken as a direct response to cultural suppression, not just literary interest.
Precisely. And the difficulty of that retrieval underscores the preservation argument. As John Fardan, a scholar involved in the project, observed, the very act of translation in this context becomes a form of retrieval and rescue. Communication was just severed. The poems had to be painstakingly collected from fragmented sources, old ebooks, archived web pages. This immense effort is what ensures the culture survives the campaign aimed at erasing a culture. It's an intellectual defense of the Uyghur spirit that exists independently of any single policy demand we might make.
That reliance on the content, while compelling, it brings us to a crucial point about the regime's actual target. If the poetry isn't universally seditious, why are the poets imprisoned? The repression is so intensely targeted at the intellectual elite, which to me necessitates an activist response focused on the immediate safety of these specific individuals.
That's a powerful point, and I agree the targeting is precise. But we need to ask why the regime targets them with such surgical precision. Is it just because they're political dissidents, or because they are the carriers of culture?
Well, the source material is clear that an entire generation of Uyghur thinkers has been systematically silenced. Professors, writers, scholars. This is a systematic assault on collective knowledge, on the community's leading voices. And it requires a unified, high-profile activist response. We can't ignore the raw political calculus. We have explicit political charges. Gaisa Imin sentenced for 17 and a half years for separatism. Abdul Rashid Berkuz for 13 years. These are political prisoners. And the book is a platform to expose that profound injustice and demand their release. Their physical safety has to be the priority.
I agree that the intellectual class is the target, but I believe the cruelty of the repression lies in its precision, in how it turns previously legal, ordinary cultural materials into evidence of guilt. We're talking about approved Uyghur language textbooks, poems published in local newspapers years ago, all of it retrospectively criminalized. This tells me the regime's goal isn't just to punish dissidents. It's to render culture itself unsafe, to turn basic cultural life into a crime. If you only see this as a political struggle for liberation, you miss the deeper struggle to validate the legitimacy of their cultural output.
But the charges are clearly political. Separatism, extremism.
Yes, the charges are political, but the evidence used to support them comes directly from ordinary cultural output. By focusing on the intrinsic literary value of the work, which, as we said, wasn't internationally known radical material, the book successfully resists that political criminalization of basic cultural life. The success isn't solely defined by freeing the poets, though that is paramount. The enduring success is proving that what they wrote was valuable, legitimate literature, not sedition. It's a defense of the culture itself.
Okay, but if we accept the urgency of the situation, then the book must be promoted as a tool for justice. I mean, to get that necessary global visibility, it has to be treated as a highly promoted cultural artifact. Justice relies on exposure.
I'm not entirely convinced by that reliance on external market forces, because it sort of implies that the impact of the message is dependent on global media cycles and publishing success, rather than the intrinsic power of the words themselves. Doesn't that risk commodifying a human tragedy and potentially diluting the very urgency you're championing?
It is a risk, but it's a necessary pragmatic mechanism. The publisher, Murat Akijana, he explicitly stressed the critical need for international exposure. He talked about selling licenses, translation rights, even film adaptations. He cited the example of another book about Savitsky, which managed to save a museum in Karakol, Pakistan, just by attracting international attention. For the Uyghur poets, he argues that promotion is necessary because, quote, if the books will not be read, will not be sold, this business will just stop existing. The justice movement needs that engine of visibility to survive and to keep the poets' names in front of policymakers.
I see that as the publisher's mechanism for institutional sustainability, which is valuable, of course. But the preservationist impact is far less reliant on the global marketplace. The enduring power of the poetry is internal. It's intrinsic, evidenced by the fact that these works survive surveillance and prison walls even without a big promotion. The poems themselves represent a poetics of resistance. Think about the specific examples of poems smuggled out of jail like Gaysa İmen's Namles and Abdülhalim Jalaluddin's Inaram.
And those poems became powerful rallying cries precisely because they were publicized and taken up by the activist community.
Yes, but they were set to music and became powerful voices in exile. And, crucially, they were later banned in Xinjiang. That ban shows that the content's resilience affects the region even without external promotion. The poetry's preservation and circulation among the diaspora already fulfills a critical role in cultural continuity, separate from the high-stakes politics of international advocacy. The preservation happens regardless of whether the book is a bestseller. The cultural victory is already assured.
But if the goal is defined solely by preservation, then we risk normalizing the captivity of these poets. We risk turning their suffering into a tragic but beautiful literary footnote. The ultimate measure of success must be a tangible change in policy and the freedom of the prisoners. The goal is to ensure the world bears witness to this cruelest and most inhuman persecution. The mission is ethically incomplete until the poets are released. The focus on justice provides the moral weight to push for that change.
That is an incredibly important ethical challenge. But I would frame the relationship differently. The book already achieves a critical success by confirming that the Uyghur spirit will never be extinguished. The preservation of the language and emotional depth, the love, the longing, the resilience in a poem like Nameless, that guarantees cultural continuity. And I would argue that is the necessary long-term victory against cultural erasure. Justice is the immediate crisis that activists must tackle. Preservation is the historical legacy that defeats the regime's ultimate objective. If the regime succeeds in eradicating the culture, what good is justice later?
And we cannot afford to choose between the two. But when faced with an ongoing genocide and the systematic silencing of an entire intellectual generation, the book must prioritize its urgent activist potential. It has to push for the release of these intellectuals and achieve human rights justice. The power of the poetry in this context must function as the engine for the movement.
And I'll affirm that the survival of the poetry itself, demonstrating the rich, deep, and non-seditious identity of the Uyghur people, is the most profound and enduring act of defiance against a regime aiming to eliminate a culture. The literary rescue ensures the victims are remembered not just as statistics of abuse, but as vibrant contributors to global culture whose work defied prison walls.
This material really offers a profound insight into the power of literature under duress. The book is, at the same time, a deeply personal anthology of love and suffering, and a public rallying cry for freedom.
Exactly. And that complexity, the poetry of deep cultural emotion, published as a demand for political change, it shows that the line between cultural preservation and political activism is truly blurred. But the focus we place on the book, I think, ultimately determines how we understand its lasting legacy, whether we see it primarily as a blueprint for urgent advocacy or as an enduring monument to cultural resilience.